So I'm going to start the day talking a little bit again about sort of the basics. First thing I wanted to think about when we think about the basics, when we think about seed growing, is why bother? I think that it's, all of you are in this room today probably for a reason. There's not everyone necessarily sees a reason in saving seed, because you can buy seed at the store, you can buy seed from Johnny's. Why bother saving your own seed? And so I wanted to throw it out to all of you. What are some of the reasons that motivate you to save seed now, or motivate you to want to learn how to save seed?
Land races.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So the idea that there's varieties out there that are potentially adapted to your region, to your climate, that may not really be in the commercial seed trade. You might not be able to flip through a catalog and find it, but is something that if you take the effort to save that seed, you can preserve that local adaptation. Yeah, so being able to preserve cultural diversity in your food by preserving the seed. Again, the seed market, and you'll probably hear this more throughout the conference, but it's traditionally, looking at the conventional seed marketplace, it's a very global industry. Seeds are developed that perform well all around the globe, that perform well for the biggest markets, and in general, both small regions and cultural needs that aren't part of kind of the dominant needs of the marketplace tend to be ignored. And so by preserving seeds that are appropriate to a particular culture, you're able to also preserve those traditions. Any other reasons that, yeah?
Saving money.
Saving money, that's right. Yeah, I think that one of the great examples, farmer here, Nash Huber, grows a lot of carrots, and his 400 bed feet of carrot seed crop on a per acre basis is by far his most profitable crop, because it saves him thousands and thousands of dollars of seed costs. Yeah, so the ability to preserve genetic diversity. One of the things at Organic Seed Alliance is we've always felt that things like seed banks are really important. The idea of being able to preserve seeds in vaults and be able to collect seeds and bring them and keep them in a place and keep them safe. But really, in addition to that, what we also need is diversity out in the landscape, on fields, being adapted and grown by farmers and gardeners. And all of you who are in the seed saving community are taking part in preserving our agricultural diversity and expanding it. So that's a really good reason. Yeah, so this opportunity for empowering individuals to understand the whole cycle of their food. It's taking it a step now from thinking about how your food is grown to how that seed is grown, and it's a really incredible educational opportunity to see that you grow. So many people have, gardeners and farmers have grown lettuce, but then to take that lettuce, from it being a head to bolting, flowering, setting seed, and then getting that seed and saving it and returning it back to the ground the next year is such an educational experience and such a better, kind of deeper understanding of the cycles of how food is grown. Yep, so the idea of preservation. You may have a variety that you've somehow been received custody of. It's entrusted to you. It's this older variety that, an heirloom that's been handed to you that if you don't grow it, if someone isn't growing it, seeds are living things and they have a lifespan, and unless they get grown out, their vigor will decrease and they'll get lost. And so being able to preserve these varieties is really important. Yeah, so being able to find and kind of propagate native seeds that might be appropriate for our changing climate. I think that's really important. Quality control. Yep. Yeah, that's a really good point. I think that just knowing where your seed comes from and how it was grown is really a useful thing. Again, this will probably get hammered more throughout the bigger conference, but seed is grown all over the world. When it's conventionally produced, it's often very chemically intensive because they have a long crop cycle. There's lots of diseases that need to be controlled and pests, and so when you're buying seed from the larger conventional seed marketplace, you don't know where it's grown, how it was grown, and you might not necessarily know what you're getting. When you grow it yourself, you know exactly where it was grown and how it was grown, and if you do a good job of it, you'll know what you're getting. To share with others, that's right. Yeah, one of the great things about growing seed is that quite often you end up with, it doesn't take a lot of seed to plant a lot of ground, and so you can have this really big impact on your community, whether your local community or the broader agricultural community, by having really good varieties that you're stewarding and then sharing. Yeah, that's right. There's the idea that you're taking control of your own seed, of one more input in your system that you have control of, that you don't have to flip through the catalog in the wintertime and cross your fingers that the company decided not to drop that variety that you really depend on your farm. Instead, it's on you, and you have the power to make sure that variety continues. Yeah, so those are all really good ideas and really good reasons to grow seed. I think we talked about all of them that I had thought about. So with that in mind, I'm going to just again go through briefly a little bit of terminology and a little bit of biology, really focused on the fundamentals of what you need to know for growing seed. So first thing I want to show you here is this very cartoonish version of a flower. And a flower, of course, is the sexual organ of a plant. This is where plant sex happens. There can be male and female parts on a flower. We have male parts here being the stamen, female part being the pistil. And the thing to think about, I always want to hammer home when you're thinking about plant anatomy and the context of growing seed, is one of your responsibilities as a seed grower is, in order to make seed, what has to happen is that pollen needs to go from here, from the stamen, and needs to travel over to the pistil. It'll land up here on top of the stigma, and it'll actually germinate just like its own little tiny seed and grow a pollen tube down through the style, and then ultimately fertilize eggs that are here inside the ovary. This journey that pollen has to make can be really short. It can be as short as within the individual flower, just like depicted in this picture. But as you'll see in a couple of slides, it can also be a longer journey. It may have to travel between flowers on a given plant or between plants. And in order for the pollen to successfully pollinate, meaning move over from the stamen to the pistil, and fertilize, meaning actually grow the pollen tube down and fuse with the little eggs here in the ovary, the conditions have to be right. And so often that comes down to, it needs to be not too hot, it needs to be not too cold, it needs to be not too dry, it needs to be not too wet. Pollen grains are very small, and they can be really susceptible to fluctuating conditions. So knowing for a given crop what the appropriate conditions need to be during pollination is going to help you at the end of the season not end up with a bunch of fruits that then don't actually have very many viable seeds in them. So at the end of the season, you may be harvesting a bunch of tomatoes and go and then as you're slicing them, you say, boy, there's hardly any seeds in here. Well, it could just be a variety thing. If you haven't grown that variety before, it may just be that it's a variety that doesn't set seeds very well. But it could also be a matter of, okay, well, was it actually a fairly cold summer during during flowering? Was it, was there something that was inhibiting in some way pollination in another fashion? The other thing to keep in mind is somehow the pollen has to make this journey. Again, if it's on a given flower, it can be a very short, easy journey, but if it has to travel between flowers or between plants, it needs some kind of mechanism to make that. So that can either be wind, in the case of plants like spinach or corn, or it can be insects, in the case of things like squash. So if it's insect pollinated, you need to know what insects need to be present and how am I going to be able to encourage their presence and activity on my seed crops. Super basic seed botany, biology 101 is looking at seeds. And what I really want to show you when you look at a seed is what is inside of a seed. Anyone have a good idea of what's inside of a seed? An embryo, that's right. So you have an embryo, which is essentially going to be, there's many of the parts of the ultimate plant in here. You'll see that there's little, embryonic leaves here. There's a little root radicle that will develop into a larger root. So there's so much of the plant's already there in the seed. What else is there besides the embryo? Yes, food, starch, sugar. That's exactly right. That's what makes up the bulk of a seed. Essentially, when you think about a seed, it's think of it like a life raft or a little escape pod on a spaceship. This is plants' attempt to take their genetics, take their life, and send it off into the future to then propagate in the following year or years down the line. In order for that to be a successful journey on the life raft, they need to have a good amount of food in them. And so as a seed grower, one of the things that's going to make sure that you have seed that germinates well and that's vigorous when you plant it and when it grows is that you ensure that the seeds that you're growing are fully mature and have developed all of the food that they can before you harvest them. And subsequently, when you store them, you want to store them in a way that they minimize the amount of metabolism that's happening during storage, because what actually happens is there's like a little life raft, their food is being eaten during storage. And so you want to think about how to minimize that. And we're going to talk about that later on in the day. So next kind of way that there's a lot of ways that people slice and dice seed growing. And I'm going to introduce you to some of this. Again, it's an opportunity so that as we go deeper into the cultivation, as you talk to other seed savers and seed growers, you know the lingo, because there's a lot of shorthand that's used that has implications for cultural practices. And so one of them is conversations around exactly how are the flowers arranged on the plant. So the basic 3 ways that flowers are going to be arranged, they're either going to be perfect, and this means just like that diagram I showed you earlier, that we have both male parts and female parts in every single flower on the plant. This perfect flowers, I'm going to show you later, are generally a feature of plants that self-pollinate. However, there are lots of plants that do not self-pollinate or self-pollinate at low rates that also have these perfect flowers. And I'll explain to you some of the mechanisms that plants use to ensure that they cross with each other even though they have male and female parts so close to each other that you would think that self-pollination would be easier. Plants use the separation of male and female parts as one strategy to encourage cross-pollination. One of the terms that we use is monoecious plants. These are plants that have male flowers and female flowers on the same plant. In other words, they have flowers that have just male parts and they have flowers that have just female parts, and they're on the same plant. So here's, one example would be squash plants. Corn is another example. What are the male and female flowers of corn?
Tassel and silks?
Yeah, exactly. Yep. So the tassels are a cluster of anthers, and then the silks, each of those silks is actually a very long style and stamen. And actually, if you follow a silk down, each one of those silks goes to an individual kernel. So those are two examples where male parts and female parts have separated on the plant with the idea that that encourages a certain degree of cross-pollination. Taken to the next level, you see dioecious plants. These are plants where you have the entire plant has all male flowers or all female flowers. So examples, spinach, there's a number of fruit trees, cannabis. Those all have plants that are either male or female. That being said, nature is usually a little fuzzy, and so you'll often also find within there a certain degree of what we call hermaphroditic plants, so that you'll have a female plant that still has a couple of male flowers on there. And those often will show up in response to a lack of pollen around. So if there's no male pollen coming in, then the plant says, okay, I got to make seed, and we'll put out some male flowers. Yeah?
This might be the answer.
Yeah. So the question is, would you want to rogue out hermaphroditic plants? It depends on what your goal is. If you're saving spinach seed, there wouldn't be any real reason you would need to, unless you were trying to, for some reason, have a hybrid spinach where you wanted to be able to separate out your male plants and your female plants in order to make a hybrid spinach. That wouldn't be something that you would necessarily need to rogue out there. To derail us further, in spinach, I'll just point out real quick. Actually, in spinach, there are the hermaphroditic plants. There are female plants and there's male plants. There's also something called fast male plants, which are male plants, but they're really little and they just immediately go to flower. And those ones you often want to rogue out because those are ones that in a vegetable crop will be flowering when you'd rather just be harvesting leaves. So another way we can slice and dice plants is looking at their life cycle. So we can look at seed crops are generally going to be divided into annuals, biennials, and to a certain degree perennials. Annual plants are plants that go from seed through their vegetative life cycle, meaning they're growing leaves, roots, stems, etc., but no actual reproductive parts. And then they'll go into initiating flowering and setting seed all in one year. There are kind of, some of these, just because they are theoretically an annual, may actually be taking you more than 1 year to grow. For example, something like a crisp head, iceberg lettuce. Those have been bred to be very, very, very slow to bolt, and so you'll often actually be starting those, the previous winter, just in order to have them get all the way through the season and set seed for you. But in general, they all go through this seed to seed cycle in a single year. And you can think about these crops, we have a lot of annual plants that we use as our food crops. I mean, this is a long list here: lettuce, sunflower, peas, cucumber, broccoli. I mean, all these, this could go on. And what it comes down to is that, if you think about it, a lot of crops, this strategy of annual plants is one that's a strategy of kind of weedy colonizer plants. These are plants that can quickly go into a disturbed space and grow and make seed and colonize that disturbed space. And so that's sort of their natural strategy, but it works really well in the farming system, right? Because that's what we're doing. We're creating a disturbed space and then filling it with weeds, essentially, that we want to eat. So all of these crops sort of have that strategy: go in quick, grow quick, make seed. I listed here real quickly, peppers and tomatoes, and, a few other examples like scarlet runner beans. Those are actually, technically they're perennials, but they are pretty much always treated as annual crops within our climate. If you're in the equator, you could do these as perennials. Or if you're in, say, Florida or in a greenhouse or something like that. Second main category of crops that we're growing are biennials. So these have a slightly different strategy. First year, what they're doing is they're focusing on growing vegetatively. They're putting in their energy into growing leaves, growing stems, growing roots. Often one of those plant parts is serving as energy storage. So if you look at carrots or beets, you're talking about they're storing energy in their roots. Cabbages storing energy in their leaves. Onions storing it in their leaves, essentially. Their modified leaves. Chard, celery, storing it in stems. They're storing all that energy for them to save it up through the winter and then go into their second year with this essentially battery full of extra energy that they have saved up. So that way the next year they can continue to photosynthesize in the following year, but as they transition out of vegetative into reproductive and setting seed, they now are going to have 2 years worth of energy to produce a really big seed crop that next year. So year 2, they're now going to be flowering and setting seed. One of the important concepts to understand as a seed grower is how do these biennial crops know when 1 year is up and they've now entered their second year and it's time to switch from vegetative to reproductive. And for most of these, that is generally determined by the process of vernalization. So vernalization is, in essence, plants sensing a certain amount of cold time. And once they say, okay, well, it's been cold for a certain length of time, this must be winter time. When it warms up again, now it's going to be the next spring. We're entering the next year. Now it's time to transition from vegetative to reproductive. This here says approximately 8 to 10 weeks at less than 50 degrees. This is a safe number, and it's very much a ballpark. Yeah?
Devernalization.
Question of devernalization. You asked me that question before. So this is let me finish with vernalization, and then I'll get to devernalization. So what's happening here is this is an accumulation of cold hours. So if you have, say, in the wintertime, it's less than 50 degrees out 24 hours a day all the time, then after 2.5 months, your plants will be fully vernalized. If you're in a climate where only your nights are dipping below 50, so only 12 hours of the day are below 50, then the cumulative time would be more like 16 to 20 weeks. Your mileage may vary with this, so many crops require less vernalization than these numbers given here. That being said, there's a lot of risks with not providing enough vernalization. Does anyone here live in a place travel from a place that's warm in the winter? So all of you who have warmth in the winter, I have an example. I taught this class or a similar class down in Ojai, California, so just a little north of Los Angeles, and one of the people who was at the class said, we had this carrot seed crop that we were growing. Carrots, biennials, require vernalization, but we just had a really warm winter, and what happened was, unfortunately, at the end of the winter time, not all of our carrots bolted. Only about a quarter of our carrots ended up bolting and setting seed. But at least we got something. We were disappointed that we didn't get a good yield, but at least we got 25% of our carrots were able to set seed. Does anyone see the concern around saving seed from the quarter of the carrots that were able to bolt in a warm winter? Yeah.
Pushing the bolting gene.
Yep. So you're pushing your population, and I'm going to hammer this home throughout this day about the idea of, as a seed saver, you are a plant breeder for good or ill, and you're going to be making selections. And if you select the plants that are able to bolt, even though it's not cold out, what does that mean? It means that if you then took that seed and you sent it to someone that had a cold spring, and they plant that carrot seed in the spring, and those carrots only require 5 days of cold weather before they bolt, well, then they're all going to be bolting for that early spring planting. Breeders have worked really hard on trying to increase the vernalization requirements for a lot of these root crops for just that reason, to avoid the issue of spring bolting on a vegetable crop. And so you want to make sure that you don't end up in a situation where only a fraction of your crop is bolting because you didn't get enough vernalization, because that's going to start to shift your population towards the plants that can bolt with just a little bit of cold. Does that make sense? So what do you do in the face of climate change? It depends on your region. I think there's going to be plenty of regions that are still able to get this vernalization in the field. But yeah, one option, and we're going to maybe talk about this a little bit in seed production, but for a lot of these biennials, depending on your region, what you're going to do is you're going to grow them rather than what we call seed to seed, where you plant the seeds in the ground, you leave them in the ground the whole winter, and then next year you harvest seeds off of those plants. Instead, what you do is you do seed to seed, where you grow the roots, harvest those roots, and then store them somewhere in a refrigerator, in a root cellar if it stays cold enough, over the winter to get your vernalization. The other thing that lets you do that's really useful is you can actually look at, for carrots and beets, the things you care about, you can't see until you pull them up, so you can actually look at them and say, oh, I like this one, I don't like this one. I'm not going to be saving seed from these ones I don't like, and throw those away before you keep your stock. The seed industry will respond to market forces, and so if it's something like chard, for example, there has been a lot of breeding work that had gone to make chard bolt resistant. However, there's a lot of demand out there for cheap chard seed for things like salad mix, for baby greens. In those cases, bolting isn't quite as much of an issue. What's more of an issue is getting really cheap seed, so you can plant acres with millions of seed per acre on it. And so in response, companies are producing in Sacramento Valley of California, Israel, places that are really good climates for producing seed, but do not have that vernalization requirement. To get to your question about devernalization, so the point there is that this is not necessarily, though this is a good general rule and a good general way to think about how vernalization happens, know that it is more complicated than this. You can have situations where if you've got a warm spell in the middle of the winter, you'll actually lose a little bit of that vernalization, and we'll have to make it up later. Vernalization can interact with day length, so depending on where you are and what climate, you may have bolting happening earlier or later with vernalization. It's definitely going to depend on your crop, your climate, and year to year. These numbers here, 8 to 10 weeks below 50, are pretty safe numbers. You talk to seed growers who have experience in these crops, and they'll be like, I just need to do 4 weeks. And they very well might be right. So the question is, does it need to be continuous? The answer is no, it can accumulate. There is the issue that was brought up by the gentleman in the back there about the idea of potentially losing some vernalization if it stays warm for a long time. But usually, in general, you're just going to be able to keep accumulating it, even if it's not all at once. Yeah, so where do you draw the line of if you don't have all of your plants bolting in the field? I don't know. I don't have a hard and fast rule for that. 99% sounds safe. 95% probably safe as well, because there's other things that might be going on. There might be a reason that plant just is a dud. That root just is not going to bolt ever. And so, knowing that you want to keep that to a minimum, you want to make sure that almost everything is bolting. But yeah, it's not necessarily have to be 100%. Let's see, what else to think about here? Real quick, when you're thinking about biennials, you have an additional challenge. You have a number of additional challenges. You have this whole issue of vernalization and making sure that you've got bolting. You've also got this issue of the fact you're growing a crop for 2 seasons plus a winter. So you have to think about how you're going to manage that. Like I mentioned before, you can do it on a seed-to-seed basis, where you're just leaving it in the ground the whole time. That is often how some of the biggest growers do it, but the minus with that is that if you're never looking at, if you're talking about a root crop, if you're never looking and selecting your roots, things are going to go, there's a general tendency for things to devolve. The adaptive advantage, often the plants that grow the most seed and are the most vigorous are going to be have the hairiest roots and crazy forks and things like that. So if you're not actively pushing back and saying, no, that's not what I want, over time your population is going to shift that way. So lifting the roots is, for 99% of the situations is going to be the smart way to go. Then the question is, what do you do with those roots? Do you put them back in the ground again? When you're putting them back in the ground, you have an opportunity to change the spacing, because you're now going from something where you're just growing roots to now you're going to be growing big seed crop plants. And I think Sebastian and Steve will talk about that a little bit later. But when you replant, you can replant at a better spacing, or you can store them over the winter and then replant them in the spring. All of that means that you're probably going to want to expect some loss there. That what you're starting with in terms of number of plants, not all of them are going to survive the replanting. Not all of them are going to survive in winter storage. And so you need to kind of work backwards and know how much you want and have extra going in. All right, so those are some of the ways we divide up seed crops. The question was from lifting things. You're asking for if you're lifting a first year biennial seed crop, how long before you replant? Generally, you can store, depends on how good your storage conditions are, and it depends on how long and cold your winter is. So there's a lot of variables there, but many of these root crops can store quite well for months in the winter, especially if you provide good storage conditions. So each crop requires a little bit different, and I'd point to, we've got a couple of good references. We've got a bunch of references over there that include some specific seed production guidelines for specific crops, but then also a couple of books that cover the details. But some crops you want to maintain really high humidity for them to store well. Some you're going to want to have lower ambient humidity. There's a range of temperatures that are ideal for storage for winter, but they can typically store for a long time. And then you just want to plant, and then it varies a lot. You can either just fall replant or you can spring replant, and so then you just want to be thinking about when you can have ground that's available and amenable to replanting. Yeah, so with kale and chard, the downside there is going to be that you may have a shorter harvest window because they're going to move more quickly. So the question was, in the tropics, what's the problem with just going ahead and letting some of these start to move into a little more of an annual cycle with a shorter window between vegetative and reproductive life cycles? And yeah, the main thing is that you're just losing some of your harvest window. Yeah, Bill?
But couldn't you begin to select for that then? Still annual, but longer harvest.
Yeah, an example, carrots. There's actually two really distinct populations of carrots in the world, and one is in fact a tropical, which is an annual. And it really is a little bit of a different crop than the biennial carrot that we know. It tastes a little different, and it looks different. So while it is advantageous for the tropics, it becomes a different plant.
Yeah, there's definitely things that are reticent to bolting, that require some tricks. Sometimes onions, in order to force bolting, people will cut off, the top 2/3 of an onion. Because if you think about how an onion, when you think, so for many of these biennials, what you actually replant is not necessarily the whole root. So with a carrot, for example. What you need to know is where are the growing points? Where is the what we call the meristems on that plant? And so with a carrot, you've got a growing point at the very top, and then you've got all of those little rings that are around a carrot end up becoming your second year roots growing out. And so you can actually cut off half or 2/3 of a carrot root as long as you have the top preserved with a little, with some growing tissue that's at the top there, a little bit of leaves left, and a third of the root. That then becomes what they call a steckling, which is essentially just a root that's going to be used for planting for seed. With beets, the roots are actually going to grow all the way out of the bottom. What you think of as sort of a beet root is actually kind of half root and half stem, and so the bottom, you still need to preserve the bottom of the beet as well as the top. With an onion, the growth point is actually is going to be near the bottom of the onion. And so you can cut off the top half of an onion and it will still regrow. A lot of times there's issues around disease, so people might use a little bit of oil coating on it to keep disease out. But sometimes when people are trying to force bolting on onions, they'll cut them, and that will help initiate it. But there's what you find is you go down the rabbit hole. Some crops are relatively easy, and some crops are not. Some varieties are relatively easy, and some require some tricks, and some require the right climate. Might require you to be at a certain day length. So the final big picture slice of how things are divided in the seed growing world, and I think many of you already know this, but I want to dive into this in a little more depth, is this division between self-pollinating crops and cross-pollinating crops, aka selfers and crossers, aka inbreeders and outbreeders, various names for this concept of, in general, how frequently do the plants self-pollinate? In other words, pollen coming from male on a single flower to female on that same flower, versus cross-pollinate, meaning moving pollen between plants. As seed growers in a seed-growing community, it's usually fairly convenient for us to sort of just divvy the world into these two camps of this is a selfer, this is a crosser, because it allows us to kind of conceptualize how to treat them. But what's important to actually know is that it really is a spectrum. That some crops, over here we can see on the far end, things like peas and lettuce, these are really highly self-pollinating. 95, 99% of the time they're going to be self-pollinating. As you move down the spectrum, you begin to see things that are generally self-pollinating but can cross, and things that have a decent mix of both, the things that are primarily cross-pollinating but still actually have some self-pollination in them. Still have some degree of self-pollinating that happens. Even within a given crop type, you'll see that there are differences, variety to variety. Something like tomatoes, for example. There are tomatoes that are much more highly self-pollinating and ones that are more highly cross-pollinating. And the reason to know sort of where your crop is on this spectrum is because it has two implications for two key concepts that you want to know about as seed growers. I want to actually, there's three things I want to make sure that you remember from my little spiel here. And one is, the first is what I first touched on, which was that as seed growers, I think probably most of you aren't afraid of this word, but I'll throw it out there. You all are plant breeders. And what I mean by that is, for good or ill, you are changing the genetics of your seed crop. You can improve the variety over time by selecting for the traits that you care about and eliminating plants with traits that you do not want to have in your seed crop. You can also, through inaction or through various other circumstances, decrease the quality of your seed crop in terms of what you want from it. So that's the first thing I want you to think about, is that you're not necessarily ever preserving a static thing. You have to be actively responding to your seed crop and helping to make sure that it's going the direction you want to. Otherwise, it's probably going to start to drift off course. So you're all going to need to continue to wear this plant breeder hat. Okay, second key concepts I want you to know about is the idea of isolation distance and the idea of population size. I'm going to tell you what these two things mean. First thing, isolation distance is how far does your seed crop need to be from another flowering crop of that same species if you don't want them to accidentally cross. So there's a couple of things I can unpack in there. First is I said the word species, and this is really important. All of you as seed growers are going to need to learn your Greek or your Latin. You're going to want to learn the scientific names of the seed crops that you're growing. And you're going to want to have an idea of what other varieties, what other crop types are the same species. So, a good example will be something like ornamental gourds, zucchini, regular, porch pumpkins. These are all Cucurbita pepo. They might be called gourds and pumpkins and zucchini, but they're all the same species. If they're all flowering at the same time in close enough distance, they will cross-pollinate. The flip side of that is you can grow a butternut squash and an acorn squash and let's say kabocha squash, and those are all squash, but we have Cucurbita pepo, Cucurbita maxima, Cucurbita moschata. We have 3 different species of squash. And so, though in the literature there is some examples of those crossing, in general they don't cross-pollinate, and you can actually grow multiple types of squash in the same farm and they won't cross because they're different species. So that's the first thing to think about when you're thinking about isolation distances. What else do I need to be isolating it from? What else is in that same species as my seed crop? Yeah?
Like with Queen Anne's lace and carrot.
Yes. So,
Go ahead.
yeah. So the question was, what about Queen Anne's lace and carrots? So I think Steve's going to talk about that a little bit, but that's a good example. Not only are we talking about what other cultivated crops are in the same species, but are there wild or weedy relatives that are in that same species that can cross? Can you grow your carrot seed crop in a location that has tons and tons of Queen Anne's lace? Well, you're going to have a hard time because those are both the same species. They're insect pollinated. They require a decently large isolation distance, and you're going to have a hard time ensuring that you don't have cross-pollination between carrots and Queen Anne's lace. These terms up here are real generalizations. First, I'm going to say we have our free seed saving guide that has a nice table with some more specific numbers for different seed crops, and that these numbers are not necessarily, they vary depending on a number of things. They vary depending on do you have any kind of physical barriers between your seed crop and another flowering crop of that same species? And are there woods separating it? Are there buildings separating it? Is there something else that's really attractive to some insects that might be pollinating your crop that are dividing the two different varieties of that same species? So if you have some sort of physical barrier, that's something that would allow you to potentially decrease the amount of isolation that you need between seed crops. Another thing is kind of how large is your seed crop. So if you're talking about growing a 20-foot long bed of something for seed, and your neighbor down the road also has a 20-foot long bed of something that's flowering, probability dictates that there's going to be less of a chance of accidental crossing between those than if you're growing an acre and your neighbor's growing an acre. So the size of the seed crops matter in terms of the isolation distance. If they're smaller sizes, then you can decrease the isolation distance. Another thing to think about is kind of what's the worst that's going to happen if you have a little bit of crossing. So it's sort of this risk management issue. There's almost always going to be some amount of crossing that happens if you're in an agricultural region, and pollen can find its way into an updraft and travel for hundreds of miles and fall back down. And though I mentioned earlier how fragile pollen is, sometimes it's not, and sometimes it survives. And you can see these crazy stories of rare outcrosses that happen that you wouldn't expect. How big of a deal is it? Maybe it's not a very big deal. If you're growing, and this is actually what happens in the Willamette here. If someone's growing a crop of, say, a red beet, and there's a process where everyone has this what they call pinning, where they'll take I think it's all done on the computer now, but it used to be actual pins in a wall at the county extension. Put a pin in the wall and say, I'm going to grow a crop of red beets here, and they draw a little circle around it and say, okay, within 1 mile, no one else can grow any red beets. But if you're growing gold beet or Swiss chard, same species, beets and chard, same species, or a sugar beet, or GMO sugar beet, now you need to go out 3 miles. Because they know that within 1 mile, there's going to be, maybe 1 in 1,000 plants or something like that are going to be crossed. But if it's a cross between a red beet and a red beet and it's 1 in 1,000, how big of a deal is it? If it's a cross between the Swiss chard and you plant out a big field of seed from that, those Swiss chard will stand up like a sore thumb. You'll see them in your field of beets, and a grower will say, something's wrong with this seed, because it'll be very visible. If it's GMO and it gets tested, that can be a huge concern. If you want to avoid 100% GMO contamination, then you want to make sure your isolation distance is really large. And so what's the risk? That's another consideration in terms of the isolation distance. So isolation distance is one thing that generally, again, depends on where on the spectrum and the seed crop you're growing is, and also what mechanism of pollination is occurring. In general, things that are insect pollinated have smaller isolation distances than wind pollinated. Wind can carry things the furthest. It also depends on how light the pollen is. Second thing to think about is population size. So population size is how many plants of a given variety do I need to save seed from so that my variety can remain vigorous and with the diversity that I need in that variety. Again, this tends to be follow the same spectrum where the self-pollinated crops require fewer plants to maintain vigor than the cross-pollinated crops. And what this comes down to is, there's two reasons to save seed from lots and lots of plants, to have a big population size. The first, and generally the reason that has the highest consideration in seed production, in commercial seed production, but is not the only important reason, but the first one is the idea of what we call inbreeding depression. So for some of these crops like corn over here, if you save seed from just one corn plant and you grow it out the next year and do that again the next year, what you'll see is that the corn plants will get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. The ears will get smaller and smaller and smaller, and that's called inbreeding depression. These crops like corn and spinach and beets, carrots, all of these have require crosses between other plants to maintain vigor. Just like, I think it's relatively easy for us to understand, just like humans. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, so garlic is actually, when you're growing garlic seed, 99% of the time what everyone's talking about is growing seed garlic, which is clonally reproduced. So what you're looking at there is generally not going to be an issue around this inbreeding depression because you're cloning a crop. That's maybe even more severe than self-pollinating a crop. Usually when you see something like that, it may have to do with accumulation of maybe a viral load or something along those lines in terms of reduction of vigor there. I don't know the specific reason why it was happening to you, but I can tell you that it probably wasn't genetic. For most of these crops we're talking about, these are not clonally reproduced. These are sexually reproduced, meaning that they're happening through their seed propagated, true seed. And so with these outcrossing crops, just like people, I think we all understand this. If we're talking about a little, I don't want to pick on a particular country, but a little village of that was founded by 3 families, and they all they all marry each other. Over time, you'll start to see more and more accumulation of these negative genetic traits that start popping out. And the same thing happens with these outcrossing plants. On the other side of the spectrum over here, with the inbreeding plants, they've actually they've sort of weeded out a lot of those bad genetic traits over time. In evolutionary history, the plants that did not survive inbreeding did not survive. And so these ones have basically evolved to tolerate inbreeding, and so that's not as much of a concern. And so you don't need to save as many seeds from them in order to maintain vigor. That being said, there's another really good reason to save seed from many plants, and that's to maintain genetic diversity. And so even though, say, you're saving seed from dry beans that are inbreeding and won't show this kind of depression, if they won't show this loss of vigor from saving seed from too many, if you have received this land race of dry beans that has a lot of genetic diversity in it, it may have within there the seeds that can grow well in a drier year, and a wetter year, and a hotter year, and a colder year. If you plant that out in a hot, dry year and only save seed from one plant, you may have lost a lot of the genetic potential in that variety, in that land race. And so that's another reason to save seed from more plants. Regardless of whether or not you see this loss in obvious vigor, you're potentially losing potential that's in this variety that you don't even know about, but may be important in the face of changing climate. Yeah.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but go to the other end, to the outcrossers.
Yeah.
Say you, for whatever reason, only have 1 or 2 plants of corn or an amaranth.
Yeah.
And it's got a really interesting characteristic you haven't seen. And so, by going by this, you go, oh, I can't save those seeds because I don't have 200 of them. But you still want to save them, correct? Because you can bring that vigor back in with other populations down the line.
Yep.
Is that-
Yeah, so that's a really good point, Bill. I think one of the things to know is that these numbers here are partially to help you if you're thinking about, boy, why did I've been saving seed of my corn, and it just seems like it's getting less and less vigorous. What's going on? Well, you can say, well, how many plants were you saving? And you have an idea of why. But these rules are definitely there to be broken, and there's lots of ways that lots of examples of why you might want to break these rules. Like Bill said, if you've only got 2 plants of something really special, and you want to preserve those genes, that variety somehow, better to save it than to not. And again, you can potentially mix that back into a larger gene pool later. There are other strategies if you're limited, say, in space for growing. You can't grow 80 cabbages, but you would like to be able to maintain the vigor of it. You can have a buddy system where you and 3 other people are each growing that same variety, and you share the seed at the end of the season. You can try and produce enough seed over the course of a couple of years. And what I mean by that is, say you start with a bag of seed, and you take that bag of seed and you take take a bag of cabbage seed, and you take a quarter of that seed out, and you plant it the first year, grow seed, save that seed over here, go back to your original bag of seed for planting stock for the second year, again grow seed, add it into your first year's seed production, third year, again, go back to your original seed, plant it out. So now you've basically, over the course of 3 years, been able to grow 3 times as much from that without cycling through and decreasing the vigor, if that makes sense. I'll point out one last thing here, which is that the Organic Seed Alliance worked with Seed Savers Exchange to write this seed garden book. We have an example there, and one of the great aspects of our relationship there was there's a lot of push and pull. We at Organic Seed Alliance tend to come from a background of commercial seed production, of trying to maintain genetic diversity, and Shannon over at Seed Savers Exchange really pushed back with some of the questions, like what Bill was saying, was like, is this necessary? What if it's a seed saver that just has, cannot grow 200 plants of corn? What can they do instead? And we went back and forth, and we have some recommendations there with the realization that a lot of times you can get away with growing less for a single year if you need to, without overly bottlenecking a population. There's also a lot of variability in terms of where something comes from. For example, when we look at squash, we sort of put this in the middle here and talked about wanting somewhere around 40 plants of squash. That being said, some squashes are both very diverse and have a lot of what we would call hybrid vigor that comes from being outcrossing. Some squashes, in the process of breeding them, have already been inbred quite a bit, and the variety essentially came from a single plant. And so it doesn't really matter how many plants you grew of that. You more or less have a limited pool of genetics that you're starting with. The thing's already been inbred. And so if you're saving seed from a couple of plants of that, you're not necessarily going to be decreasing its vigor or losing a lot of genetic diversity. And so there's a lot of asterisks here, a lot of things that will depend on a given variety. What we try and present to you is sort of some safe numbers. So I think one of the things, last thing I want to talk to you about in terms of population size here was, again, pointing out the idea that when you're working on your population size, when you're thinking about how many plants you need to be saving seed from, you want to work backwards. We're talking about at the end of the year when you're actually harvesting seed, how many plants do you have? So there's lots of things that happen between when you first plant those seeds and when you're harvesting seed off of them, and that includes losses in the field. It includes losses in storage in the case of those biennials. It also includes the fact that you want to leave enough wiggle room so that you can do selection, so that you don't feel forced to save seed from every single plant, whether or not you think it looks any good. You want to be able to rogue out, as we say, the plants that are not as vigorous or are not true to the type that you're wanting to be selecting. And so you want to have you want to be starting with extra plants so that after losing plants, after removing plants, you still have plenty at the end of the year. I think that was all I was going to cover for the beginning. If you have more questions, we can cover them for a few minutes here. Yeah, for eggplant, I would look it up, but eggplants are, they're a mixed crosser and selfer. I would, just off the top of my head, I would say I would want to end up with somewhere around 20 to 30 plants.
Yeah, eggplant of all the solanums, the nightshades, peppers, tomatoes, eggplant is the most outcrossing, and probably that would be the one you want to have a little bit larger population than some of your other, like peppers or tomatoes.
Yeah, so the question is, how do you know what the other farmers are growing? I don't know if you want to, maybe I can pass it on to one of you two.
Well,
I'll give you a chance to talk.
yeah. One thing is that formally, in some places like the Skagit Valley in Washington, where they grow a lot of spinach, there's actually pinning maps. I guess maintained by maybe it's county extension or the Growers Association. So actually, they've actually located all the sites, say, where the spinach fields are. Now, we're talking about fields that could be up to 50 acres or more. So there's massive pollen loads. Now, if you're talking about you have 100 plants in a garden somewhere tucked away, probably that's much less of an issue. However, the ones that are growing 100 acres are not going to be affected by your 100 plants, but you may be affected but vice versa, you could be affected negatively. But you can find that out in terms of where the real big production fields are. But in terms of if you've got gardeners all around, that's harder because you may have your neighbor like 200 yards away is growing corn, and you're growing corn. Well, you might have to, strong arm them. Well, no, not strong.
You can give them free seed.
Yeah, you can be kind to them and
Give them free seed of the variety you're growing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to answer some. Bill brought up a couple of good points. The first is, corn is special for lots of reasons. I have a bias towards it, but it's also special because it has something that's called the zinnia effect, and that is when it's basically exclusive to corn that you can see if you have a white corn that you're growing, say, you can actually see the effects of pollination that year. You'll be able to see if there was yellow corn pollen coming in, you'll see yellow kernels on there. So that's great. That doesn't work for the other crops. But what Bill brought up is another really good point, which is that if you're concerned about contamination and you have wiggle room, a lot of times if you've got a big enough block, and this is what they do, corn seed, for example, is grown in the Midwest. And there's a lot of corn pollen happening in the Midwest, and they put, their number, the official number is 666 feet between fields, which was a lot less than the 2 miles I said there. But what they do is they go in 8 rows inside of their field before they start treating it as a seed crop. And so what you'll see for a lot of these crops is that the contamination is going to happen on the edges. The outcrossing is going to happen on the edges. That's where pollen's going to blow in or insects are going to land first. In the middle, that pollen tends to just be coming from within your seed crop. Yeah, so those are 2 strategies. And I think we're going to talk about a little within cultivation, but first is, if you can create a row of crops, or, if you're dealing with an insect pollinated crop, if you can create something that's attractive enough that the bees and flies, once they get to there, they're going to just probably hang out there for a little while. They're going to scrub themselves of pollen, by working all those non-seed crop flowers that you have on there before they go anywhere else. That can help decrease it. And then sometimes what you're dealing with is, and I think that Sebastian's going to talk a little bit more about that, but there's other alternatives. If you don't have isolation distance, you can isolate using physical barriers. Potentially you may be able to isolate by time so that things aren't pollinating at the same time. So there's other ways to deal with it. Yep, that's a really good question. Now the question was, we'll see if we get to it at the end of the day. I have an optional, if we get all the way through, I've got a little optional bit about getting a little more in-depth into some of the breeding topics, but I'll mention this right now because it's a useful thing thinking about when you're selecting. For some crops, you can, the things you care about, so say you're growing lettuce or Swiss chard or carrots, the things that you care about, you can see before any pollination has happened. And that's great because that means you can, if you've got an ugly looking lettuce plant, you can get it out of the field. It will never contribute its pollen to the population. It's out of there. For other crops like eggplants, like squash, like corn, the thing that you care about, you care about lots of things, but the actual, fruit of those is what you're eating and what you're looking at, and that has occurred after pollination. So how do you select then once it's already been pollinated? There's two strategies. The first one is that selecting what we call maternal selection. So selecting on just the plants that you can see. You don't know where the pollen came from. It might have come from ugly plants. It might have not. But just selecting based on the plants that you can see, even after pollination, is still good. That's still better than nothing. If you found a really nice looking eggplant and it's already set fruit, the pollen's come from every which where, you're still half of those genes are coming from that plant, and so it's worth saving, and it's worth getting rid of the things that are ugly, even though they have spread their pollen around. You're still doing better to get rid of those seeds. You can, with some of these crops, you can be able to, so an example is with something like summer squash. What you can do in a crop like that where it has a long enough fruiting window and a long enough window of seed production is you can actually allow those plants to set fruit, evaluate the plants based on the fruit. So you get your first, you let, maybe not your very first flush of fruit because those are often got a lot of weird things on there because of poor pollination, but your second, third flush of fruit on a summer squash, you can look at those and say, okay, these plants look good, these plants don't look good, get rid of all the plants that don't look good, hoe them out of the field, get them out of there, and then you can do what they call resetting, where you would basically pick all the fruits off of your seed crop, all the flowers off of that seed crop, and now when the next flush of flowers comes out, it's going to be coming into a field that won't have any pollen coming from the things that you've rogued out. With something like eggplants or corn, it gets trickier. You can either be hand pollinating, so that way that the thing has only been self-pollinated. You can self-pollinate it for a single generation. And they'll tolerate that as long as it gets mixed up the next year. And then you'll know that if you selected something that looks good, you're only getting those genes. The other thing that you can do, what we've done, there will be some good examples, I think, in the conference. We have like 8 talks on plant breeding, and I'd encourage you to come to them for some of the examples. But something like we've done in sweet corn is what we'll do is we'll actually plant out. We'll plant out short rows. We'll save seed. So say we save seed of our 50 nicest looking sweet corn plants. That seed, that pollen might have come from everywhere, just like your question. But the next year what we do is we do something a little different. We have seed from 50 different sweet corn plants, and we keep them in 50 separate little bags or packets, rather than mixing it all together into one thing. The next year what we can do is each of those little bags came from a single plant. It's all kind of related. Those seeds are all sort of related to each other. We can take those seeds and plant. We can take half the seed out of each of those 50 packets and plant a little short, say 10-foot row. Those rows are made up of what we call half siblings. They're all related, based on their mother. And you can kind of look at them and see overall, how did that row look? How did this other row look? And then you can go thumbs up or thumbs down on a row by row basis. And then stuff's all been crossed up in your field, but what you can do now is you can go back to your old seed packets where it hasn't crossed that year and take the ones that you like. So if you found 10 good rows, you go back to those 10 packets. I know that was a little confusing. Usually I show it with some slides, and I can review that, but that's another strategy for selecting with a crosser.
Just a couple other comments about the eggplant. You can actually, if you give it a long enough season, you can actually pull it off with eggplant, because you can pick those first fruit, because that's what you're really interested in, is the quality of the fruit. And of course, then you have to pick off all the flowers that have pollinated, and basically you're resetting, as Jared said. But if you're able to extend the season, so you may need a greenhouse or something like that, but it is possible with eggplant. Winter squash, maybe not so much. As Jared said, summer squash works great. Now with corn, an interesting thing, you can look at other things, what I call linked traits, before pollination happens. Like say, like we were selecting for a high anthocyan and a purple sweet corn, and looking at other things that would indicate that your kernels were going to be all purple, and that would be maybe the wrapper leaves or the stalk color, things like that. And so you have to observe that as you go along in the season and make notes about what other possible physical characteristics that you could identify prior to pollination, and then select. If it doesn't have those other characteristics, then you rogue it out, eliminate it.
Yeah. So the question is, if you're living in a warm climate, kind of to your question about the tropics, and how important is that fertilization? Well, if again the often the biggest minus there is if you're able to trigger, if you're accidentally triggering bolting too quickly, then that's a problem. But if you're in an area that never really gets cold, then you don't necessarily have to worry about premature bolting that same way. Like my story, with the carrots, it's like, okay, well, if you never have cold springs, then you're not gonna, if the only way these plants are getting vernalization is through in the fridge, and they're never going to experience it out. They're never going to experience cold enough temperatures that might trigger bolting, even with stuff that's really prone to bolting with short periods of vernalization. Then you may be okay. As a seed grower, it's one thing to keep in mind is sort of what's the intended purpose of this seed. Are you saving this for yourself? For your particular climatic needs? Are you growing this commercially with the hope that this is going to be able to be successfully produced by farmers in a range of climates? Depending on the answers to those questions are going to depend how much concern you have to put towards things.